This is a production of Cornell University.
So I know that you heard cybersecurity and you're like, this is very different. So I do two very disparate things. If you have questions about cybersecurity or blockchains, that's sort of 90% of my real job at Stanford, and I'm happy to answer those as well. And this is kind of the 10% of my time where I wanted to get back into protein engineering, and so started to work with GFI. GFI is kind of a think tank. We're a completely remote organization, and so we don't have lab space of our own, but we support researchers at universities across the world. We fund some research, and we work with companies that are developing both plant-based meat, which is what I'll talk to you about today, and clean meat, or kind of cell-cultured meat, which I think will be part of the future of replacing some of our current animal agriculture. So one of our reasons for doing this in the first place is that we project that we're going to need to feed 10 billion people by about 2050. And the way that we currently use the Earth's surface now, in terms of how much land is devoted to habitable land, how much is ocean, how much is glaciers, how much is forest, how much is used for agriculture, how much is used for livestock, we think is not going to be a sustainable way of feeding this many people by 2050. We think that particularly the amount of cropland and the amount of grazing land that goes toward livestock is a relatively inefficient use of those resources. And so you can kind of argue over whether these population projections are going to be accurate. And when I was giving a talk at the National Academies, Stephen Chu, who's the former Secretary of Energy, was like, no, I think that humans have an internal kind of like quorum sensing mechanism, and that we're going to see populations start to decline because he thinks that people are going to kind of look around and realize that we're not using our resources efficiently and like control population. I'm not sure that we're seeing that happen. It's hard to argue, it's hard to like kind of tell people that things are going to be okay as long as we just all decide to start having fewer children, because I've tried to make that argument, including at the National Academies, and people are like, haha, it's too late. We're already in our mid-30s and 40s. We have them already. So I think what we need to do is we need to change the way that we're eating and the way that we're feeding those people, because we kind of need to assume that we are going to have more people in the world who we are going to need to feed, and that this is going to be an inefficient system. So why is it an inefficient system, and from what kind of perspective do we think of it as being inefficient? If we just look at kind of thermodynamically inputs to outputs, how many calories of feed need to go into making an animal, and then how many calories of food can we get out of that animal, we see that the majority of the livestock that well, actually all the livestock that we use are inefficient. And in fact, some of the primary more efficient species, we're not even talking about cows, which we know are inefficient because they're such large animals, but some of the smaller animals that we grow, like pigs and chickens and fish, are also very inefficient in the sense that the amount of calories in that are converted to calories out is somewhere around 10 to 12%. For cattle, it's even lower. For cattle, it's below 10, it's about 8%. There are some species of farmed fish that can get you up to like 20 or 22%, but the way that they calculate that, kind of like the life cycle analysis of the farmed fish, in many cases, doesn't take into account the nutrients that it's getting from the kind of surrounding ocean that the farm is in. So a lot of like farmed salmon, they'll do off the coast of like Nova Scotia, off the coast of Maine, and they'll be in these pens that are semi-permeable. They are able to get some nutrients from the surrounding ocean water, and that's not taken into account in the LCA, so that kind of bumps up the efficiency numbers. And actually, they're running out of coastline to make farmed salmon. So the latest thing is that they have bought, companies that are farming salmon have bought just plots of land in like central Florida. And so they're making just these incredibly large pens on land filled with water, kept very cold, because salmon like a very cold environment. So even though they're in Florida, they're these kind of like refrigerated, cooled, cooled tanks that they're growing farm salmon in. So if you want to talk about inefficiency and about the effects on the environment, not only do we sometimes see that in farmed fish, we get disease spread from the pens into the ocean because they're these semi-permeable pens. If we're going to try to grow fish that require cold water on land, then we're really getting into to lower efficiencies than we think would be optimal for being able to feed as many people as we're going to need to do. So we can also talk about it in terms of then food waste. We know that food waste is a problem in terms of recapturing the nutrients that we're able to grow and produce. And the amount of food wasted by consumers or in the supply chain is dwarfed in comparison to the amount of food wasted in producing chicken or beef as two of the most common animal protein sources. Another way of looking at that is that we devote quite a lot of our land mammal population to our pets and livestock as opposed to wild animals. So we also see some habitat loss, kind of off-target effects of growing this many sheep, goats, pigs, horses, and cattle, where we're using a lot of land that could be either used for crops or could be preserved for natural environments, using it to grow livestock. So if we think that that's a problem, then why do we see that global demand for meat is increasing? Across all categories of meat, based on both U.S. and global demand, we see that we have increased demand for meat between now and 2050, as well as particularly increased demand in fast-growing and populations in developing economies. Part of the reason for that is that as people get richer, they want to model their diets more on what we think of as traditionally Western diets, where they want to eat more meat, where meat is seen as a status symbol. And so that's why we see some of the highest growth rates in terms of meat consumption in faster growing economies. So we're projected to eat a lot more meat by 2050, and particularly a lot more chicken. And that meat is going to have to come from somewhere, but hopefully it doesn't have to come from the same system that's being used to produce it. Another thing I want to point out is that we don't actually have like a protein deficit. We're eating much more protein than we need, particularly in wealthy regions. For some reason, we're not all like buff and muscle bound, so some of this protein is just kind of going to waste. But if you look at the average daily protein requirement across different countries and how we're meeting that requirement, in many places around the world, we would be able to meet all of that protein requirement just with plant protein alone, and not need to take into account all the kind of excess animal protein that we consume. So taking that into account, we want to look at the idea of whether we can replace some of the animal-based protein that people are using with plant-based proteins. So what are plant-based proteins? I feel like this audience probably knows what those end up becoming. These are some of the plant-based meat products and plant-based dairy products that are currently available. It's anything from replacing chicken and beef in a sandwich to replacing cheeses, other types of plant-based dairy products, even kind of additives into combined products where you'll have some animal meat and some plant-based meat that are combined into what's called a blended product. We want, again, to look back at plant proteins as replacing animal proteins because they're more sustainable. And they're more sustainable in terms of land use, in terms of water consumption, in terms of greenhouse gas emissions. Beef is the least efficient animal meat in terms of land use, but all animal meats to the right of the dashed line perform worse in terms of all of these categories than plant-based foods do. So if we want to transition some of our protein consumption to more sustainable proteins, it kind of behooves us to look into plant proteins rather than trying to optimize maybe the efficiency of farmed pork or farmed fish. There's a long history of plant-based meat, but the history of kind of the directed engineering of plant-based products really happens in the last 15 or so years with the Beyond Burger and the Impossible Burger, which I'll talk about in some of the newer products that these companies are developing. But plant-based meat, we can kind of trace back to some of the earliest known meat substitutes. Things like tofu and yuba and tempeh are kind of in a category unto themselves in the sense that when we do market analyses where we look at like Nielsen scores of supermarket sales in terms of a plant-based meat category, they don't lump tofu or tempeh or yuba into that category. They think of them as a separate kind of a separate product. So when we're talking about plant-based meat sales, we're talking only about products that are like veggie burgers or veggie sausage that are specifically designed to replace a particular meat component and not something like tofu. But we see historically that tofu and like wheat gluten tempeh were used to replace meat products as far back as 965 AD, 1815 for tempeh in Indonesia. Some of the then nut and peanut-based meat substitutes that were developed, as well as tofu, soy-based meat substitutes, were aimed at a religious audience, an audience that didn't want to eat meat either one day a week or for other religious holidays. And these started to be commercialized by John Kellogg and others at kind of the start of the 20th century. The first US meatless burger, the soy burger, was from 1937. We see then the advent of textile manufacturing tools to produce textured and spun soy protein fibers, the idea that now we can take plant proteins and make them into textures that look a bit more like muscle fibers and that replicate better the texture of a piece of meat. And then we start to see more commercialization, Morningstar Farms, Joe Fergie, kind of the Boca burgers that you might have been familiar with in the 90s. The FDA released in 1999 a statement that consumption of soy protein may reduce the risk of heart disease. So that kind of improved marketing and commercialization. And then Beyond Meat and Impossible Foods were both founded in the Bay Area, both by chemists named Brown, so they are frequently confused, but two separate companies. They make the Beyond Burger and the Impossible Burger, which they launched within about a year of each other, so also frequently confused. But I'll go into the differences between them and kind of some of the strategy behind making these kind of more engineered plant protein burgers. So a lot of what GFI wants to do is support companies to enter into this space and also to support research in this space. And when we put out a call for proposals for plant-based researchers, worldwide doing research on either texturing of plant proteins, extracting plant proteins, growing plants that have higher concentrations of proteins. The way that we categorize it is in terms of this mind map, where we look at what goes into making plant-based meat, everything from sourcing protein, isolation and functionalization, formulation, processing, and then distribution. And we look for research that's going on in all of these areas because we think that we're going to need to have process improvements across all pieces of this mind map in order to get to products that meet consumer demand in terms of taste, price, and convenience, and are able to replace some of the animal-based meat market currently. So starting with ingredient sourcing, to make plant-based meat, we have to have plants provide all of the raw materials, so not just the protein, but to provide the carbohydrates, the fats, the flavorings. I'll talk a little bit later about why it's particularly difficult to incorporate plant-based fats into these products when comparing it to something like the fat that's naturally present in beef or pork. So this can involve things like crop engineering and breeding, genomic trait mapping to see which parts of the plant genome correspond to higher protein yields or higher bioavailability of protein. And it also involves looking at different sources of protein from things like algae, even from non-plant sources like fungi that we usually kind of just lump in with plant proteins. When we look at what proteins from plants are used in plant-based meat right now, it's still predominantly soy. Soybean and wheat are kind of the three main plant proteins that are used in plant-based meat products, and soy overall is the most popular. Part of that is because soy is a complete protein. So when you look at analyzing a plant protein, you look at the PDCAAS score, and that looks at the concentrations of different amino acids in that protein. And you want something that's as close to 1 as possible so that it has it has all the nutritional requirements of the amino acids that we cannot synthesize ourselves dietarily. And soy meets that. Soy is around 0.9 to 1. You can reach a PDCAAS score of 1 by combining other plant proteins, but that kind of nutritional completeness of soy protein is one of the main reasons why soy is predominantly used. But part of it is also because plant proteins for a long time were used or thought of as kind of something that like a secondary use of these crops. And so we have a lot of field space devoted to soy, devoted to wheat, devoted to corn, to feed crops, or to feed livestock and to grow as other crop sources. And so that was part of the reason also for why we used these proteins, even if they may not be the ones that most closely mimic animal proteins in terms of the extracted form and the functionalized form. Some of the studies that we're looking at are how nutrition profiles vary across different grains, where we might be able to extract not only the protein, but also the fiber and the fat from those grains to make more ingredients available for plant-based meat. So if we look at the macronutrient content in just cereal grains, we see a variety of protein concentrations, but then also a broader range of variety in terms of fiber, fat, or oil that's available for extraction. And then similarly, the micronutrient content, even among millets, where there's a project that we work with at Berkeley that's trying to increase the cultivation of millet and study both the availability of protein in millet and also the nutrient content of millet. Millet is a lot more commonly grown in Europe, not as much in the US. The reason for that they find is that when they try to encourage farmers to switch over to millet, because there's not a strong millet market in the US, they have trouble getting crop insurance for it. And then because they can't get crop insurance for it, they don't grow it. So it's kind of this catch-22 cycle of trying to get people to switch over on a large scale to a new cereal crop. But some of the benefits then of trying to extract protein from this crop is that you can also get the subsidiary benefit of having better micronutrient contents from that crop. And so if you want a product that has a high iron concentration, because you know that iron leads to kind of like a meaty taste, or leads to more of like a bloody taste, you may want to have a crop that has higher levels of iron to begin with. Another way that we're trying to study the variability in plant proteins is through how environmental conditions impact crop performance. So even if we're growing the same crop, we know that pH levels and nitrogen levels can vary quite a bit in the soil. And then we may need to look at, for example, for pea varieties, how growing pea varieties in these different soil concentrations affects the protein content, which is something that's usually not part of a general yield study. So what we're trying to do in supporting this research is to optimize these crops to improve the raw materials. We want to improve the nutrition and the functionality and the performance of the plants that we're using. We want to improve the bioavailability of the protein that we're extracting. We probably want to improve the concentration of the protein in that plant. And we also want to do that in a way that decreases cost. So of the projects that we support at these various universities, one of the ones that's focused specifically on that is this one at Clemson University that's characterizing field pea and sorghum crops to try and improve the protein content of them and improve the nutrition for plant-based meat. this is kind of one of the first studies where they're specifically selecting and optimizing cultivars for protein extraction for plant-based meat and for protein biofortification. Another one is looking at quinoa as a raw material for plant-based meat products, so trying to characterize and optimize existing quinoa varieties and optimize protein extraction methods that you can prototype different kind of quinoa protein products. So quinoa is cultivated around the globe, and it's considered to be pretty resistant to abiotic and biotic stresses. The average grain yield for quinoa is 2.5 to 3.5 tons per hectare, and then in the last 10 years, this group has conducted experiments to cultivate quinoa in Israel, and they've increased that to an average grain yield of 6 tons per hectare. So they're thinking that quinoa might be a more sustainable crop in Israel than in other areas where it's grown. It could be highly commercially valuable there. They're going to try to evaluate quinoa as a sustainable source of protein itself, taking seeds from high-yielding quinoa accessions and characterizing them for protein content, fat content, fiber content, looking at different extraction methods to prepare the protein concentrates and protein isolates, fiber and defatted quinoa flour from these kinds of raw materials. So that's one of the projects in Israel. There's another company that we work with that's an Israeli company, Equinom, and they do crop breeding and strain development to improve multiple traits simultaneously. So they were founded 6 years ago. They're kind of a breeding and seed development company. And what they're trying to look at is ways of increasing protein concentration in these plants, as well as other things like color and taste and amino acid composition simultaneously. So they've done that with yellow pea in about 3 years. They increased the amount of protein in the yellow pea strain that they're working with from 16 to 20% to about 28 to 30% in the seed. They also have projects with cowpea, fava bean, mung bean, lentil, quinoa, with the university that we're funding in Israel, chickpea and sesame. So they'll collect as many kind of cultivars and variants, varieties as they can, genotype and phenotype them, algorithmically just simulate all the potential crosses that they could do with these varieties, make those crosses, and then with kind of 2 to 3 cycles per year, look at which end up having, in this case, higher protein concentrations or better taste, better amino acid composition, and iteratively narrow in on which are going to be the best crosses for, in this case, for protein composition. So it's not particularly directed. They're kind of trying to make this entire field like a matrix of all the potential crosses that they can make with all the varieties that are available. Part of the reason for that is that some of the crops that they're working with are poorly characterized in terms of what improves protein concentration, and they're also trying to do this in a relatively short time frame. So based on the success with yellow pea, we're working on them to try to increase protein concentrations in some of these other varieties with the hope that if we can get the protein concentration in some of these varieties up to the same level as we see protein in soybean, for example, or in rice and wheat, then we can start to transition some of the use of soy over to some of these other crops. So these are some of the protein sources that we look at, both in terms of PDCAS score, in terms of functionality. For example, do they extrude well? Are they something that has good like whippability, that can make good emulsifications? So starting with soy as kind of the benchmark PDCAS level, pea has a similar PDCAS level and is pretty good in extrusion, usually low allergenicity, sometimes non-GM, which can be important for entering European markets. Protein from canola or from rapeseed is actually very good, but it has limited availability in terms of getting protein isolate. Other pulses have lower PDCAS scores, but can be in some cases combined to reach the point of soy. We are looking into hemp protein as well, sunflower protein powders that can reach up to 50% protein, corn and oats that are usually lower nutritional quality, lower protein concentrations. But there's one that I like because they have chosen the name protein, which is very clever of them. And that's a 54% oat protein concentration that's mostly used in breakfast cereals, nutritional shakes, that kind of thing. So we're looking into kind of other sources of protein with the idea that we've only looked at maybe 8% of the total available crops that could be used for plant protein. And so we don't know for certain that those 8% that we've looked at and characterized are going to be the best in terms of mimicking either the nutritional functions of animal protein or the structure and formulations of animal protein products. So some of the other kind of underutilized or neglected crops that we're looking at as sources of plant-based protein, just based on the protein content of the plant itself. Winged bean protein has about 35% protein in the seeds. Lentils, about 25% protein by mass, and they also have very good gelling and emulsification properties. Dry broad bean, 25% protein, good whippability, good foam stability. Dry cowpea seeds have up to 25% protein, and these form good emulsions. Lupins have high protein content as well, and they have favorable properties compared to soybeans. We may be able to replace some of the soy protein in products that we're using with lupin protein. Some others that have been characterized less well, Bambara beans have a relatively high protein content. Dulse, which is this kind of red seaweed, and I'll talk about a project that studies red algae that can have between 9 and 25% protein by dry weight, but is one of the main kind of aquaculture sources of plant protein. Mesquite beans, and then duckweed, which is traditionally consumed as a high protein food source and has a higher protein content than soybeans, but doesn't have very good characterization of its functional properties. So we're trying to fund research into extracting protein from duckweed and looking at functionalization of that as well. One of the projects that we're funding in the US with this company called Trophic is looking at deriving protein from red seaweed, from macroalgae. So the supply chain for red seaweed right now, there's about 18 million tons produced and has up to 45% protein in the plant. So we think that would be a good candidate for plant protein products, as well as because it has this kind of umami-like flavor profile, and because it's red. So people expect sometimes, expect like beef or other kind of meat products to have that coloring, and so being able to have that in the plant itself as a secondary extract would be useful for that. The key challenge here is developing an extraction process for extracting the protein from dulse that meets cost and quality targets. So this group is trying to optimize their protein extraction processes to meet the quality specifications of some of the secondary companies that want to make plant-based protein products out of these seaweeds. We also look at other types of non-animal cell culture, so I won't talk about these here, but we're also looking at using bacterial proteins or mycoproteins, sometimes in conjunction with plant-based proteins, as natural sources, both of protein itself and of flavorings, stabilizers, pigments. So most of the projects that we're funding in this area have the aim of improving the nutritional profile of crops and plant-based meats, either using selective breeding or genetic modification to breed plants with higher nutrient levels or higher protein levels, so we can get protein extracts more easily, get higher quality protein extracts, either for dietary supplements or for plant-based meat. Another project that we funded with the Foundation for Food Agriculture and the Open Philanthropy Project is trying to optimize the use of pulses for plant-based meat. So along with identifying new or underutilized sources of crops that we can use, we can also optimize crops that are currently in use to be better for plant-based meat, to increase the amount of protein in them or to increase the bioavailability of them. This project is characterizing the texturization abilities and the molecular characterizations of pulse proteins, including where they bind other molecules like flavor agents, how they unfold during the cooking process, and computationally which genes can be added or edited to pulse seeds to produce varieties that are improved in this area. This is too many words on one slide, but this is basically it's a two-phase research process where in phase one, they're using high-throughput digital phenotyping and sequencing to functionally characterize a variety of pulses with a focus on gelation, water holding capacity, and fat binding ability, which are important for making a plant-based kind of burger or product that's going to be kind of a mixture of this protein slurry and some kind of plant-based fat. And they're also looking at the structuring ability of proteins from pulses or in these ingredient combinations to form a fibrous structure that looks more like tissue that would kind of have this meat-like appearance and texture. So all of this is going to be publicly available online so that in the second phase, they can use that data to perform precision breeding to improve pulse crops for the explicit purpose of making these crops better plant-based meat ingredients and cultivating them for plant-based meat applications. So there's an entire pulse council that is supporting this and that thinks that one of the ways that they can improve the market for pulses is by selling to kind of a growing plant-based meat market. This exemplifies some of the ways that we're trying to make data collection and analysis available to researchers more broadly, so that we can have kind of a database of what crops are best for plant-based meat, which genotypic and phenotypic characteristics lead to higher protein expression levels, so that people can then go on and do studies based on that, where they're trying to optimize other maybe crops or other plants that we haven't identified as potential sources of plant-based meat, or do some of the studies we were talking about, like with soil condition, to see which characteristics then improve the bioavailability of the proteins in these crops. Another of the projects that we're funding that's kind of similar to that is looking at fermentation of oat protein for application in extruded meat analogs. So fermentation can improve the flavor of oat protein. It can produce additional lysine, which is one of the problems with oat protein, is that it has a limited amount of lysine that reduces its PDCAAS score. Oat protein also has some anti-nutrients, some lectins and saponins that can be degraded through fermentation. Fermentation can produce exopolysaccharides that improve the texture of the oat protein, and it can increase the overall nutritional value. So this group in Estonia is looking at exploring how fermentation can affect the quality of oat protein and make a better oat protein in terms of flavor and texture use. Other ways that we can increase protein yield, and so this was not research that we funded, this was just a paper that I thought was interesting and exemplifies some of the ways that we can improve protein yield, not just through targeting protein itself, but also through targeting plant growth. And so this project was trying to improve photorespiration so that plants, so that the primary process, which is in gray, involves the kind of expensive breakdown of glycolate, and that they were trying to engineer other glyoxylate processing mechanisms that would reduce kind of the time and the cost of the plant of doing that. And they found that this greatly increased growth of the plant, though it's unclear whether that is passed on to subsequent generations. The main idea here is that we are also looking for research projects that would improve yield of plant proteins in terms of increasing the size of proteins, shortening the growing time as well, and not just increasing the protein concentration in seeds or in leaves. So once we've then chosen a plant that we want to use in a plant protein product, we need better methods to isolate and functionalize the raw materials for making plant-based meats. That can include better methods of protein fractionation or isolation, as well as enzymatic functionalization, either biologically or chemically, and hydrolyzation. So we can either look at chemically isolating the raw materials that we want to use, or we can look at using mechanical methods to separate the raw materials. We can look at soaking and using solvents, milling or pounding to isolate various components of the plants, using enzymes and extruders to restructure the plant proteins so that they exhibit some of the same functional properties that we want in animal proteins. And many of these can be optimized for plant-based meat raw materials to improve digestibility, taste, and texture. When we talk about what type of plant protein we want to use, in some cases we want to use protein flour, in some cases protein concentrate or protein isolate. These vary based on protein content, based on how they're fractionated, what kind of fats they use. So the process by which soy protein is produced from soybeans can kick out either soy flour, soy protein concentrate, or soy protein isolate at these different steps. The soybeans themselves are cracked and dehulled. The hulls can be used as a product themselves, as a food product themselves, and then they're flaked, and then you can get soy oil from that. And so there's kind of a multi-step process depending on what concentration of protein you want to get from the soybean. And then similarly in wheat, a multi-step process depending on whether you want vital wheat gluten in your products, whether you want textured wheat protein, isolated wheat protein, and what kind of concentration of wheat protein you want. So optimizing this process and looking at other types of extrusion methods that can either involve lower temperatures or that can involve higher pressure instead of enzymatic extrusion or hydrolysis could improve the texture and could improve the functionality of the resultant protein. High pressure homogenization in particular we're looking at because we know that taste is better in products that have a higher protein concentration, but we're not entirely sure whether that's because the processing steps that are used to improve, that are used to kind of fractionate out the plant protein involve higher heat. So we're looking at whether higher pressure can end up with a high concentration protein product that has the same kind of relative lack of taste, but doesn't involve that heat treatment step. From there, we want to make a formulation from this plant protein product, and that involves adding binders, adding flavorings, adding plant-based fats, sometimes adding other ingredients that will improve the taste or smell of the product. So in terms of recapitulating the experience of cooking, when we're looking at additives that are going to be flavor and for the most part, fragrance additives, we need something that's going to be stable throughout the cooking process, and that is also going to retain that same flavor and that fragrance profile from a raw product through a cooked product. So one of the reasons why Impossible Foods decided to launch their burger in restaurants first was because they could then kind of control the way that the end product was presented to consumers. The Beyond Burger being available in grocery stores, you can take it home and open it, and a lot of people complain that it smells like cat food or that it has this kind of like off scent in its raw or natural form. So there's a course at Berkeley that I advise, and we work with Jivadan on developing new flavoring agents for plant-based meat products. And some of the interesting things that we find are that some of the molecules that we're looking at, like there's one 2-methyl-5-butylene that smells like citrus at low concentrations and smells like chicken at high concentrations. And the idea is, how can we control the concentration profile of this chemical when we're adding it to a formulation that people are then going to cook at home or make into meatballs at home. Another main component of optimizing flavor is adding, so we'll talk about heme in terms of the Impossible Burger and how they've used soy-like hemoglobin to recreate that kind of irony taste of like the bloody components of meat. Optimizing flavor also involves adding fat. And so one of the projects that we're funding at Berkeley involves encapsulating sunflower oil in a commercially available saponin and then lyophilizing, freeze drying that so that it can be used as a shelf-stable additive to any kind of plant-based meat formulation. So you can have oil that you want it to be encapsulated in some way because you want it to retain its position within the overall kind of structure of the product through the cooking process. So ground beef has 40 different types of fats that have different melting points and different levels of saturation. And so throughout the cooking process, they'll melt at different stages. Some of them will remain solid at the end of the cooking process. Some of them melt at the very beginning. When you're adding a plant-based fat, you're pretty much adding one type of fat molecule. You're adding, sunflower oil, or you're adding palm oil or something, and that has a particular melting point. So it's one of the challenges is finding ways of encapsulating that fat such that it will remain solid throughout the cooking process, so that it doesn't immediately just leak out and you end up with a very dry plant-based burger. Flavor, kind of off flavors in plant proteins are one of the main problems for plant-based meat as well. So we have a project that we're funding in China that's trying to identify what molecules are responsible for these kinds of beanie off flavors that are present in pea protein. So to identify which volatile compounds contribute to that beanie off flavor and then figure out ways of removing those compounds. So this is primarily a project that's using GC mass spec to first identify which volatiles are contributing to that off flavor, and then see if there are easy ways of extracting that through the process of producing a pea protein isolate. Some of the other technical obstacles to formulation include that in muscle, phosphates can draw protein from the meat matrix or from the muscle to the surface, and that can create kind of stickiness and help with forming a coating on top of the meat product as it's cooking. We're not sure if just adding phosphates to plant-based meats is going to have the same functional properties. A lot of times we add starches to plant-based meat products as binders. That can affect the mouthfeel of the product, and then we need to combine them with fiber in order to have a better texture and better nutritional properties. Fiber itself, though, absorbs water, and so that can also affect mouthfeel. And even though it's an effective texture replacer for fat, you don't want to have too high of a fiber concentration in your products, because then that leads to a more water-absorbing product than you may want. So we can't fully replace starch with fiber in the product. We have to figure out the optimal combination of starches and fibers and proteins that are going to make something that has the same kind of bite and chewiness of whatever meat product we're trying to replicate. The next step then is manufacturing. So taking this mixture of probably a plant protein, some kind of fat, some flavoring, some binder, and taking that slurry and processing it. And so that can include extrusion, molding, dehydration, shear cells, fiber spinning, 3D printing, as well as developing the sensing technology so that we can determine at which point in, for example, an extrusion process, we're getting the right texture and under what conditions we're getting the right texture. So a lot of plant-based meat is produced through high moisture twin screw extrusion. So this is kind of a machine that would be about like the size of something you'd put on a factory floor. Like sometimes I put a person here to show you that it's not like bench scale, kind of factory scale extrusion. So we put that pre-mixed kind of protein slurry into a feeder, and then there are co-rotating screws that are heated as well. So you can change what type of protein comes out both by the final die that cools the product and kind of cuts it into shapes, but also by the rate of co-rotation of those screws, by the temperature, by the water concentration. The idea here is that we want to produce a textured protein, similar to the way that fiber spinning machines were originally used to create soy protein fibers. We want to make soybeans or soy protein into products like soy curls or into products like any of these variety of textures and shapes. So these are all soy protein, and what we're varying here is water content, the dye, and the temperature used to extrude them. One of the other projects that we're funding is developing real-time sensors for extrusion, because we don't really know when problems develop during extrusion until they come out the other end of the die. So this could be a project that would help us improve the cost of diagnosing problems with plant protein extrusion, and also monitoring throughout the process through ultrasonic sensing within the actual twin screw itself. We can see when we're getting a better shape or when we're getting better fiber structure. Some of what we do in order to help companies develop these processes as well is do kind of back of the envelope calculations or like economic monitoring of what the scale they would need to produce would be if we want to meet certain targets of selling a certain amount of plant-based meat or producing a certain amount. So if we look at just high moisture twin screw extrusion, we can look at how many kilograms per hour of plant-based meat can be produced from the average extruder, how long they're run. If we think that maybe we want 80% of plant-based meat products on the market in 2020 to use extrusion, then we know about how many industrial scale extruders we would need to have operating globally to meet that demand. Knowing about the number of extruders that are operating currently, it's fewer than 168. I think it's about 130 or so. So we would need to scale up the number of extruders that are operating. One way we can do that is by encouraging companies to have better monitoring so that it's more economically feasible for them to increase the amount of extrusion that they're doing. But another way is to use other methods that are maybe gentler, that require lower temperatures than extrusion. So Wageningen University in the Netherlands has developed something they were originally calling a couette cell, and now they're calling it a shear cell. It's kind of like an ice cream maker in the sense that it has this large rotating ring on the outside and a static ring on the inside. And you put your protein formulation in the kind of barrel, and the difference in rotation between the outer rim of the kind of outer rotating ring and the inner static rim sets up this shear gradient, and that aligns protein fibers in a way that helps them mimic muscle fiber itself. So this is kind of what it looks like coming out of the machine. Here are some electron micrograph images of how the protein ends up structured in these kind of fibrous aligned sheets. Here's what something like the below image would look like when cooked. So it kind of replicates the texture and the perception of meat fiber. In terms of these processing methods, we also look at how processing affects both the chewiness. You can imagine that as you're rotating and setting up this shear gradient, you're mixing the protein more and maybe making it chewier, increasing gelation. So we look at how heat and pressure throughout these processing steps affects the hardness and the chewiness, in this case of rapeseed protein extract, so that we can target something that more closely mimics an animal protein that we're looking to replicate. There's also a company called Nova Meat that's looking into 3D printing as an alternative to extrusion. So they can use an ink that's a paste of rice protein, pea protein, and seaweed. So you can add colors and flavors. And obviously this is not something that's going to scale up to meet the entire demand of plant-based protein that we have, but you can produce custom designed shapes. And so it's an alternative to extrusion if you want to make something that is of a very particular shape or size. So one of the projects that we're funding that's looking at texture is looking at creating different meat-like textures by a combination of microstructure engineering and high moisture extrusion. And the idea here is that they would form kind of a plant protein matrix with one type of protein and then precipitate a second protein over that. So like a pea protein precipitated over a wheat protein or over a soy protein structure. The idea is that this would help form a fiber-like structure that's more similar to meat, and that's kind of a fiber-reinforced polymer network with a fiber filler in this matrix. And then their idea is that different meats have different fibrous textures, and so they can better target a texture that mimics fish or that mimics beef or chicken through this precipitation process of precipitating one protein on top of a construct of another protein. What proteins are used currently then when we're talking about the Impossible Burger and the Beyond Burger? The Impossible Burger, at least 1.0, uses primarily wheat protein and potato protein. The Beyond Burger, mostly pea protein. And what's unique about these two burgers, or why we consider these more like the engineered plant protein products, is, at least in the Beyond Burger, the use of beet juice for color, but more kind of interestingly in the Impossible Burger, the use of soy like hemoglobin as a heme protein that they're actually producing in Pichia pastores in this yeast. And that was kind of a novel ingredient for them to produce. So let me go ahead to like hemoglobin just a bit. So like hemoglobin, this globin protein, what they're trying to replicate is myoglobin in muscle tissue, or about hemoglobin that transports iron through the bloodstream. Because it's an iron binding protein, it has this red color, and it also gives it that kind of bloody taste. And so they originally isolated the soy-like hemoglobin from these rhizomic nodules on the root of the soy plant, but that extraction process was costly and required way too large volumes of soy root nodules to extract sufficient quantities. So they ended up expressing it in yeast, and that required them actually to go through an entire process of FDA approval to demonstrate that this was not, in fact, a new product, and that this was safe for human health. And so they had to do some rat studies of the soy-like hemoglobin extracted from yeast, as well as improving the yield that they would get from that process. Originally, they were doing column chromatography to extract like hemoglobin. That was also too costly, so they were able to then improve yield step by step, so they could just use weight fractionation and kind of have these much larger kind of fermenters, kind of similar to what you would see like in a facility that's making beer, so they could grow such large quantities of the yeast that then they didn't have to recover the same. They didn't have to have like the same standard of recovery as they would from column chromatography. So if we know that the Beyond Burger and the Beyond Burger is using pea protein, and we know that many plant-based burgers are using that type of protein, another kind of economic analysis we can do is figure out how many acres of peas we would need to grow in order to produce enough pea protein for the projected amount of plant-based meat that we're going to require in 2030 based on the growth of these companies. So we can go through and look at how much protein we get from pea. High protein varieties are about 25% protein. The project that I talked about in Equinom maybe can increase that, but right now 25%. Then we look at what percent of protein a plant-based meat product is, and then we assume what percentage of plant-based meat is going to use pea protein as the predominant ingredient. Go through some calculations to figure out how many acres of peas we would need to have that were just dedicated to producing pea protein for plant-based meat. And so that can help us project how we're going to need to evaluate current land usage, or how we should encourage farmers to either grow more peas or sell peas into the plant-based meat market. Another thing I want to point out here is that both the Beyond Burger and the Impossible Burger use coconut oil. The Beyond Burger also uses canola oil. So one of the main reasons for using coconut oil is that it's solid at room temperature, and so you get that cooking process where you can have a fat that stays solid throughout the process. But when we do kind of similar scaling questions like this and look at the current coconut oil market, and then project demand for coconut oil just from plant-based meat, we're going to reach kind of peak coconut in about 12 years. So we also need to start thinking about how we can encourage coconut oil producers to grow more coconuts, produce more coconut oil, assuming that we're going to have similar demand trajectories for the Impossible Burger and Beyond Burger that use this. So why do we think we're going to continue to have similar demand trajectories for these? We do see increasing investment in terms of both plant-based meat and clean meat year over year in terms of both deal volume and amount raised. And we can break that out into plant-based meat on the left as having raised the highest amount with the second highest number of deals, plant-based egg and plant-based dairy close behind. Clean meat, clean eggs, clean dairy, because we think that those products are still, at least 10 years out, they've raised less money, they're kind of more exploratory. But we see a lot of funding going into the development of plant-based meat, both research funding and commercial funding. And what we also see that's interesting is that a lot of kind of traditional meat companies like Tyson and Cargill are also investing in plant-based meat with the idea that they want to be protein providers, and that if there are going to be multiple sources from which people get their protein, they want to be part of that market, not kind of be disrupted in that sense. So I want to touch on some of the kind of white space ideas in plant-based protein that we are trying to find researchers who are willing to work on, because we have this competitive grant proposal process that we run every year, where we give out $5 million in grant funding, or really we give out as much money as we can raise to give out, because we're a nonprofit. Just kind of seed research projects where we can. But some of the ones that we are interested in people working on are Like we talked about, increasing the yield and robustness of crops that are used for plant-based proteins, adapting tolerance to climate change to expand the regions in which these crops can be grown, expand their growing profile, improve the amino acid profile, so produce more complete proteins in a different variety of crops that we don't always have to rely on soy when we want that complete protein. Improve the flavor profile, definitely, so decreasing the concentrations of saponins that can be bitter, isoflavones and lipoxygenases that can lead to those kinds of grassy and beany off flavors. We think that producing fats in algae would be a good way to both utilize algae in terms of extracting protein from it, as well as using it to produce kind of omega-3 or omega-6 fatty acids. We're looking at funding platforms that assess different characteristics of plant proteins within processed ingredient batches to increase consistency of downstream processing. When we do tests of pea protein, if we imagine that we are like a plant-based meat company, we're trying to buy lots of pea protein. For the most part, they include not just one varietal of pea, but they'll include multiple types of yellow, and in some cases also of green pea. They're highly variable, and they're not from one particular growing region or from one particular set of soil characteristics or growth characteristics. So we want to be able to improve the consistency of plant proteins that are available, so we can improve the consistency of then the end product when it's using something like pea protein. In terms of functionalization, we're interested in products that in projects that perform customized processing of raw plant protein ingredients to the specification of a client's functionalization desires. Again, the inconsistency in plant proteins in terms of their functional properties is a hurdle for companies that are buying large quantities of pea protein and can't rely on consistency batch to batch. We are looking at projects that remove or mask off flavors in plant-based proteins that can develop better tasting products. Kind of the holy grail for plant protein is just a protein that doesn't taste like anything, just hard to achieve, and particularly in something like soy. We're looking at ways to maybe mask those types of flavors in plant-based proteins. Looking at developing new binders, new plant-based fats, pre-textured proteins, and looking at better methods of extrusion for creating that fibrousness in a plant-based meat product, better sensors for monitoring quality of plant-based meats through the extrusion process. Some of the opportunities that we're also looking at are blended proteins. So like Sonic makes a blended burger that is partially beef blended with mushrooms. And we think that this is a way that we can get more plant protein ingredients into consumer diets. So we can have something that's a blend of an animal protein and a plant protein, and that will also increase our ability to feed 10 billion people by 2050. And so the final kind of call to action is, if we look at global R&D investment into renewable energy in 2011, when this had captured both a lot of government funding and a lot of private funding, we can see that a lot of the money that was spent into developing renewable energy went into types of energy that aren't currently being used or that weren't feasible. We haven't been able to make biofuels work. But then if we compare that to the amount of R&D that's gone into meat alternatives, which is about 1 billion, we have plant-based meat alternatives here. And we really think that with the addition of more funding, both governmental funding and industry funding, we'll be able to make much better plant-based meat products and improve the development of these products to address kind of a similar environmental problem as renewable energy has been developed to address. That's all from me. I think we have 1 minute to lunch. there may be questions.
Questions?
Hi, I was wondering if there's been any looking into about growing like protein based plants in marginal environments, because that's an argument some people in the animal science community make about, where beef cattle are grazed upon and whatnot.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, some of the projects that we're funding to look at like how soil characteristics vary in environments where there's a lot of growth of lupins and of millet is aimed at that, wondering whether we can kind of optimize some of these crops so that they produce at least like 25% protein at soil conditions that normally wouldn't be used for growing those crops. So we're looking at that in Israel and in Canada and in India in terms of either soils with varying nitrogen concentrations or areas where there's higher drought, and looking at some of these crops that can be improved to be drought tolerant but still retain about 25% protein. It's not ideal, but yeah, it's part of the projection of how many people are going to have to feed also includes under what conditions we're going to have to feed them, and the idea that we're going to have higher temperatures and more drought. Yeah, that increases the number of areas where we're going to have to grow these crops in substandard conditions.
So I know for some of the plant-based milk products like almond milk, soy milk, there's some controversy about standards of identity and calling it milk. And so I'm kind of curious, and for the plant-based meats and these other products, this industry has been around long enough that they haven't come up with a better name than plant-based meat. But is there a standard of identity conflict coming? Because these products are obviously very diverse. Can you comment on that at all?
Yeah, so there are several state bills that are pending. In Missouri passed a bill recently to prohibit these products from using the term meat, and so we're kind of fighting that bill. But on the state level, there are kind of cattlemen's association groups and other like industry groups that are trying to restrict the use of terms like chicken or sausage or bacon. For the most part, because there's been such a long history of these products being sold under those similar names, we can say that there's not consumer confusion. But yeah, on a state level, there are a couple of different bills, mostly in states that have like large ranching interests or that have a lot of meat production, like Missouri and some of those other states where they're trying to restrict the use of those particular like pork or chicken or beef terms. We haven't come up with a really good alternative name, so we just kind of have to fight that legislatively.
Hello, I wasn't sure if you might be able to comment that, but there's been work done on trying to make a vegan cheese, sort of like a plant-based cheese alternative, but seems like there has not been much progress. The taste does not seem to equate to what milk-based cheese can be done. Can you comment on that? What's available?
Yeah, there's a couple different products. I think one of the ones that we work with is Miyoko's Kitchen, and then I'm also like privileged because in the Bay Area we have access to all of these because so many of these companies are headquartered in the Bay Area, and so distribution, both across the country and globally, is a problem. But most of the problem with making a vegan cheese is in like meltability. So we can get like spreadable cheeses or something that has the same kind of texture as like feta cheese or something that's more like crumbly, but getting a plant protein that melts in the same way and it retains fat in the same way that dairy cheese does has been a problem. But yeah, I guess I feel like Miyoko's does the best. There's also like Light Life that has some of these. Daya does like a shredded plant-based cheese. Active R&D going on in terms of making better melting characteristics.
Hi. So there seems to be a trend within the food industry away from ultra-processed products toward clean label foods, and I'm curious if the industry views that as an obstacle or if it's like just a moot point because higher level values of sustainability set in or something.
Yeah, it's something that that kind of industry struggles with, as well as nutrition, because both the Beyond Burger and the Impossible Burger like have similar fat content to a ground beef burger, and they're not necessarily marketed as like a health product. They're just marketed as something that's supposed to replace a meat product. And yeah, for the most part, anything that we're making is highly processed, as you can see, like the protein extraction, protein extrusion process itself kind of makes it in that category. So for the most part, based on the idea that when we do surveys, about like 1% of the U.S. will admit to being vegetarian, and like half of them are probably lying, and so that's a relatively small like target market. So for the most part, what these companies are trying to do is get people who are carnivores or who are flexitarians to like try this product that's just going to be a substitute in terms of taste and price, and not looking as much into replacing like the less processed foods that represent a smaller proportion of the market. It's definitely a concern for like a lot of people that I work with, because when you work at a think tank that supports this, like a lot of the people that I work with are vegan or vegetarian and are also concerned with food processing, concerned with eating more raw foods. But I would say that's still relatively a niche concern as compared to taste and price, lower down on the consumer checklist in terms of choosing what to buy.
Okay. You mentioned that yeast fermentation improved the lysine content of oat protein. Does this work for wheat and barley too?
Oh, the oat protein fermentation project?
Yeah.
I mean, I don't see why it wouldn't, but we haven't found researchers who are willing to study that. So if you would like to study that, apply to our grant program this fall. But yeah, I mean, so one of the problems with oat protein that they're trying to improve is the amino acid profile, and so that's relatively unique to oat in terms of the lower levels of lysine. Some of the saponin content is not present in wheat, but there's nothing to say that fermentation wouldn't improve the taste profile of wheat or barley as well when we're looking particularly in terms of how well it can mimic meat.
Thinking of this plant-based protein as a consumer product, the price that it has, is it mostly due because it's actually that complex to make, or is it because it's new and the company needs to survive? So I'm kind of curious how the price would compare if like meat was priced as expensively as it should, given all the inputs that it needs.
Yeah.
How would it actually compete in that regard?
Yeah, I mean, all the companies are aiming for price parity. The Beyond Burger is probably like $1 or so per burger more expensive than ground beef. Some of it is to recap R&D costs. Some of it is because the processing steps are more involved. But some of the cost also comes from the fat that they need to add to it in terms of the price of coconut oil. But as they're able to scale up, and so like as they're just increasing the size of their facilities, that price should come down. And actually, when both Beyond and Impossible did a life cycle analysis of the product, they found that not only one of the main contributors to water use and to greenhouse gas emissions, but also one of the main contributors to price was the packaging materials that they're using. So they're trying to look into better and also more biodegradable just trays and kind of plastic wrap so that they can sell it in a way that it looks like it's packaged like it's ground beef, but in something that's more easily recyclable, because that ended up being one of the primary contributors. So that like packaging is also contributing to cost.
So it seems like there are many issues that could be helped with genetic engineering. I mean, things like hydrogenation levels of non-coconut oils and fats and stuff like that. Is that something that you guys are sort of actively trying to stay away from?
Oh, no. I mean, we love GM. It's only a problem for companies that want to sell into the European market, where they have some restrictions on what they can sell. But
So can't somebody out there make synthetic, make canola, make coconut oil?
Ideally, yes. Yeah, I mean, ideally you'd be able to. So that's one of the projects that's trying to look at algae as a kind of as a way that we can produce some of these fats exogenously. Cost is probably still going to be an issue, but yeah, hopefully the idea is that we can use some kind of platform like a yeast or bacterial platform to produce oils that we would need. Yeah.
Are there any other? Okay. So in terms of nutritional quality, you showed a graph of the different iron contents of some crops that people are using for these plant-based meats. Are they also measuring phytate levels to try to get at maybe some of the iron bioavailability issues that might come with plants replacing meats?
Yeah, particularly in like millets and lupins. Yeah, that's a concern. And in general, just the bioavailability of the protein in the plants that we're trying to engineer to have higher protein content. And like so in the pea study, we weren't just trying to increase the percentage of protein available in the dried pea, but also then the bioavailability of that protein as it's processed or cooked. Because we don't want to increase the protein level or increase the protein concentration, but not be able to then extract that protein and have that protein. Yeah, that's also part of what Equinom is looking into.
Maybe one last question.
Do you think that food will be affordable in 2050 if we use this method? Because it's a very expensive process. So I believe we'll have available food, but do you think it will be affordable that time?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I mean, decreasing cost is a concern, and then we're also looking at how the cost of producing livestock might increase as we're either as either the crops that we use to feed the livestock increase in price, or as we're running out of room, as in the case with like fisheries, we're running out of coastline that can be leased to produce those fish. So we're both trying to reduce the price of plant-based meat, and then also looking at maybe some kind of like intersecting curve of prices where we would see the price of animal meat increase and then match the price of plant-based meat. But the least expensive way to eat would just be to eat some of these vegetables and pulses and grains like on their own, and to not try to make them into something like the Beyond Burger, the Impossible Burger. The idea behind those is that we want to replace something that's agriculturally inefficient with something that is, and hopefully drive the price down there. But yeah, as price is a concern, like we have that graph of the different protein levels and protein sources, and so like yes, you can meet your daily protein requirement just with vegetable proteins, and those are cheaper on the whole to reduce and buy than animal-based proteins. But yeah, from a purely economic standpoint, like sure, don't buy the Impossible Burger, just buy like rice and lentils and beans and just cook them however you like with other vegetables and eat them like that. But if we want to replace meat in people's diets, then we need to go through these steps to get something that tastes similar.
We have one final question from Zoom. Andrea Beldi asks, besides the process of oat fermentation, are you also looking into improving the quality of the protein of these crops by GM or other means?
Oh, like of oat protein in particular?
That's what they asked.
Yeah. Yeah. So like some of the studies that Equinom is doing are looking at improving the concentrations and availability of that protein, and also improving the completeness of the protein itself. So yeah, GM is one way to do that. And the particular like oat protein project is just looking at fermentation because they're a lab that studies fermentation. So they had this idea that fermentation would be kind of like an easy and cost-effective way to improve the completeness of the oat protein and to decrease the concentrations of isoflavones and saponins in the oat protein extract. But certainly another lab may be able to improve oat protein in a different process.
All right, can we all join and thank Allison?
This has been a production of Cornell University, on the web at cornell.edu.